Only the dead may travel. Only once free of physical limitation can an entity pass between spheres, or perhaps it could be said is allowed to pass. Sometimes, seemingly, such an entity may transgress the bounds of time as well. But such perceptions are often misconceived illusions, as time is an elementary concept when applied to the physics of spherical interpretation. The ability of an entity to travel in regards to distance and control vary greatly, and often depend accordingly on individual experience. I hesitate when speaking of the dead to use the word soul, as the entire terminology of most religion does not accurately depict the true condition of those no longer occupying mortal bodies. Once discorporate, the entity can choose to observe almost any given arena of the spiritual universe, if said entity is aware that they are capable of doing so. In the spiritual cosmos, the phrase, "knowledge is power," is nevermore a vital truth. A limited understanding or excessive lingering unrealistic beliefs from one's previous existence can act as a chain, restricting further exploration. The dead are in fact an extremely powerful influence on this and all other spheres. It should be said that the dead influence the outcome of events in ways that the living cannot possibly fathom. Also, the act of rebirth can occur in almost any given place or time, as long as it does not overlap into a period or place where the said entity already exists, occupying physical living space, even if said living entity is another version of one's own self living in another sphere. The dead may also choose to reside within an object for a duration limited only by the object's survival. This condition is referred to by laymen as a haunting, but once again this word pales in describing the actual state of spiritual occupation. Some may question why an entity would choose such confinement, but in considering the many varied circumstances that can occur in the afterlife state, it must be considered that a sense of solidity and familiarity can be a great comfort in the confusion of the hereafter. Also, it is through this means that many a spirit can hide from what it may see as threatening forces. Chapter 3. The Book of the Skull. Kurt's initial embarrassment had been short-lived that morning. Within a few minutes after awakening, it became painfully obvious that he was growing very ill as a high-grade fever set in, and he began to shiver violently. This malady would be no short-term visitor, and Kurt was left bedridden and confused for the next 3 days. Time enough for him to reconcile the two warring realities in his mind. He lay in bed, staring endlessly at the ceiling during breaks in the chills, trying to understand exactly where he was and what had happened. At the end of that day, as the sun sank outside his window, he realized that he truly had no concrete recollections beyond vague, stirring images before the point where he had awakened on the plane to Biloxi. He could remember saying goodbye to his parents at the airport in Cleveland, but the event played out like a dream of some sitcom episode he had watched on cable. Now there was a much stronger and more terrifying series of memories that were beating against the inside of his consciousness like a hammer slamming against the bricks of a crumbling wall. It was in the dark hours of the morning that he finally thought of the Book of the Skull, translated on the school's website. Cho slept as if drugged into a coma, so did not stir as Kurt crossed to his side of the room and seated himself at the computer desk. Wrapped in a blanket and struggling to maintain some form of concentration, Kurt attempted to log on. As he watched the loading bar slowly lengthen, his thoughts once more whirled into a maelstrom of confusion. Where am I? What is going on? And why do I remember dying? The problem was worsening as his fever rose. He was seeing his surroundings and noticing a troubling transparency to what should be a firm perception of his real environment. He was, in fact, from Cleveland, Ohio. However, his parents had separated when he was 12, and he had moved in with his mother to Washington State, where he had struggled through high school only to fall into drug experimentation as soon as he started college. He had dropped out his second year when his mother had committed suicide after the most recent of her many failed relationships imploded due to her uncontrolled sex addiction. He knew that there were vast spaces of time which he had erased with substances, but he still had the strong impression that even those hazy, dreamlike recollections were as real, if not more so, than the life he remembered here. He thought of his first dream walk with the strange werewolf, and now fully understood that he had been communicating in some way with the wolf shaman, Stephen Aldry, who was also here in what he guessed was the form of Choctaw Steve, the cab driver. However, Kurt was almost positive that most likely Choctaw Steve did not know that he was actually a mask for the identity of another. Then there was the question of Angelica. She had to be the key. It was she who had started all this when she had awakened whatever dormant abilities that had slept within Kurt in the other life. Kurt felt certain that this was real, and no dream or illusion. He had somehow come to occupy another existence, and had up until now been completely ignorant of the previous. So now he could only wonder, what of the creatures that attacked me? What has become of that other world? He stared at the startup menu appeared and noticed that Cho already had the school website on his desktop. Kurt paused momentarily to try and bring some clarity to the rushing activities of his feverish mind. He was now, at this moment, 19 years old, and it was the month of August, only a few weeks until his birthday. However, he could clearly recall an entire lifetime of events that had occurred long after his 20th birthday. He could remember turning 20 and being driven by his friends to a small outdoor water park in southern Washington state. There were only 3 or 4 such parks in the area, and this was the only known outdoor center he was aware of, most water parks in the Northwest being indoor facilities. The season was over and the park was closed, but his friends assured him that their contact had agreed to keep it open for them, and them alone, for one day in trade for partaking in some of the most potent psychedelic mushrooms on the East Coast. As they drove far into the woods towards the campgrounds where the park was located, an 80s model camper towed behind them, Kurt watched as storm clouds amassed over the trees and lightning began flashing in the distance. "Come on, guys," he said nervously as they passed a joint around the Jeep. "It's going to be cold, and there's even a storm coming." "Calm down, Grandma Hartman," Josh Raymond had laughed from the driver's seat. "You're not going to feel anything but high as a space shuttle here in about an hour." Josh had been correct. What had followed that day was the most unbelievable trip Kurt had ever imagined. They had flown down water slides, howling with glee as lightning flashed in the sky above them and rain poured down in chilling sheets from the gray, thunderous clouds. They had the time of their lives. And then he had been sick for 2 weeks with pneumonia. Sick like he was right now. So what was he to believe in his current fractured state? That he had lived a life, then died, and then by some means been reinvented as another version of himself here in some alternate reality? He clicked on the school website and hoped beyond all reason that somehow there may be an answer within the translated pages of the ancient book. Squinting down as he tried to focus through the blur of the fever scorching his mind, he clicked on the first PDF file, which opened to a summarized history of the book, and a note from Professor Bashmet declaring the translations to be a rough draft that was still undergoing revision and scrutiny. As Kurt began the first chapter, he felt a curious clarity begin to ease the haze that enveloped his brain. He found that over the next few hours he was reading faster and faster, not even noticing that Cho had awakened, showered, and left for the morning. Kurt's skin felt cool and tingled with strange, tense excitement as he read. What makes a demon? What are the conditions of the demonic existence? First and foremost, one must understand that image and archetype are like blueprints for the physical and spiritual universes. In fact, it is there that the two meet on a level of existence from which the very outlines are formed, and from which springs the slow, ongoing ideas from which creation originates and unfolds. Humans are a step closer to that level than most life forms, and some humans hang just below the surface of this expanded consciousness, ready to burst through. 1 out of 1,000,000 or so minds may bob in and out of this vast state like a cormorant diving into waters before emerging. Sometimes one of these rare individuals may even become a spiritual amphibian, existing between two planes. Such is the demon, and to some extent, those with who deal with their energies. Such entities and individuals begin, as do biological amphibians, in a state of capable of sustaining themselves in only one or the other relative planes. However, through a process of long transition, become physio-spiritual mutations, which are the created universe, are quite the liability. Space-time as defined by man is presented in terms of measured physical deterioration and distance over a stretched fabric of material existence. But these concepts are primitive and exclusive to the ridiculous understanding of the human conceptual brain. At the very basis of reality, there is only creative energy, its twin opponent, and the being which perceives what is before it. At some point, the entities of which I speak grow capable of systematic destruction and rebuilding of physical realities on a perceptual level, and a human creature which has tapped the energy of such beings may well do the same. Picture an eternal spiraling helix of spheres in which infinite possibilities exist and occur, interconnected by set passages along which only the disembodied spirit may travel with the power to observe and indirectly affect given states. Within this helix, time is as much a place to which one may travel as is any destination imaginable. The demonic entity resides within a sphere unto itself, which makes its way through others, altering and corrupting as it goes, whether with an intention of destruction or not. The natural spheres hold each other at bay by force of the helix gravity, but the demon sphere will make its way through another, converging by the will of whatever consciousness within which the entity may reside. The universe contains protocols for dealing with such errant and apparently accidental occurrences. From within its sphere, the demon may well become all-powerful, capable of destroying the very physics of creation, and once the demonic spheres enters into another, it will begin to grow and consume space-time within. This process is not unlike the slow occurrence of infection within a larger body, its onset often going unnoticed until it has almost become deadly to its host. The demon may well lay dormant and passive for millennia as it sets its objectives and baits its thralls before launching a full assault upon its environ and recreates it by its own desire. This process often begins by the establishing of a link from the demon sphere to another via the creation of a genetic link into an existing bloodline of related individuals, thereby having a conduit through which it may manifest itself through these hereditary shamans. However, it must once more be stated that there will always be those individuals who will access the power of invading entities automatically, as they are exposed to these entities. It is only through these individual thief priests that the demon may be weakened and contained. Chapter 4. The Book of the Skull. Kurt had read for 70 hours. He felt that at many points he was dozing off, but still he felt as if somehow, even in a semi-unconscious state, he had continued absorbing information. After 18 hours, nearly 2/3 of the tome remained unread. But already he felt as if some new level of comprehension had been reached. The fever was easing, and the feeling of sick, confused desperation had been replaced by a sharp and penetrating focus. Cho brought him cold chicken and orange juice, which he consumed quietly as he read. Already, things were falling into place within his mind, as he visualized the town around him and the surrounding countryside in a way previously impossible. He could see the houses with their massive gardens and picturesque vine-covered outer walls side by side along cracking, segmented, moss-grown sidewalks. Even though he had never been to the cemetery, he was now seeing it from the sky, as if he were flying overhead. It stood on the far western side of town, set on a tall hill where its residents would originally have been protected from flooding. From its top, where the oldest graves were laid, one could gaze out across the entire town. Over the years, the cemetery had grown, as had the town, and its graves had sluggishly began to move downward, with a number of its monuments now standing in the backyards of those homeowners unfortunate enough to live on its expanded borders. Beyond was the swamp, and if one were so inclined, one might follow a long forgotten and overgrown path until you would find yourself standing beside a vine-buried gate in the surrounding edge of the Love estate. Halfway between the two sites lay a massive reservoir lake held at bay only by a single long levee that, like everything else Kurt had seen, seemed forgotten and unkempt. As he hovered over the water, he swore that somewhere far below the surface of the dark, unmoving water, he saw a glimmer, like a green emerald star shine from the depth of the murk, as if it had fallen from the night sky and sank. Kurt felt a certain fear at the light. He knew that a door was opening, and something down there thrashed and pushed like a worm wriggling free in the mud as if being borne to the pool. Its gleaming, scaly head thrust through, and soon its serpentine body followed, winding out like a ribbon into the opaque water. Denizens of the lake fled at the sight of the new intruder, and hid in terror, as the very waters were imbued with strange energy. Algae began to proliferate at an unnatural speed as the plants on the shore began to green, straighten, and grow with new health. The swamp began to undergo an unannounced and unseasonal spring of new life. Now the door was closing, and the thing lay still at the surface, staring at the dusk through the trees with great, slitted, empty eyes. All life grew unnerved and fearful with the knowledge that a new predator had arrived in its midst, and yet this horrid thing looked and felt oddly at home, laying calm in the waters. Although Kurt longed to see and know more, he felt himself pulled back as the vision receded. He was now, as he had been before, seated in front of the computer, exhausted. He closed the screen and stumbled across the room, where he fell into his bed to plummet into a true dreamless sleep. But before he closed his eyes, he saw through his heavy lids the great flowing shroud that hovered outside his window in the dark of night. "I know you are," he whispered, and before the world was enclosed in the oblivion of slumber, he saw the cowl of the shroud lift to reveal the skull that lay beneath. The good or evil inclinations of a demonic entity as they relate to the human race differ greatly between individual entities. The tendencies of any entity, it seems, can be altered due to the influence of its own followers. This leads to a paradox. What generates the positive or negative attributes of any given entity's power? The shaman themselves often act as a lens coloring the entity's influence. However, a demon of a certain temperament will, in time, wear down and change the vessel through which its energy flows, except in the case of the Angekok, who may draw upon energies from many sources. Here I will explain that as far as I am aware, there is no society of demons, and if this ideology is given by one, it is only as a direct and calculated deception on its own part. Demons do not cooperate, form bonds, or associate, but for the tormented possession of an individual Angekok who may well be immune to the ongoing erosion of self from a single entity, but find themselves the battleground for a number of conflicting entities. Eventually, without intervention from another individual shaman, such an unfortunate may well find every vestige of their self destroyed. Chapter 5, The Book of the Skull. Bailey, the small cocker spaniel that Jesse Rose considered to be his personal protector and guardian, was barking yet again. Of course, Bailey, being of the typical small dog temperament, barked all the time when she was outside at night. But for the past 2 nights, her warnings had escalated into the realm of panic. Bailey, not being one to cower from the darkness, had taken to standing at the very end of her leash, at the edge of the glow of the motion sensing security light, barking endlessly at the cemetery. Their house was one of the cheaper rentals that stood along the boundaries of the historic graveyard, as evident by the tombstones that, under the influence of years of erosion, had moved downhill and into many residents' backyards. There was no fence or wall around the cemetery to draw any boundary between the earth of graves and that of personal property. Bailey, as far as Jesse could tell, was staring intently at something that was drawing her canine attention amongst the worn and tilted monuments. It was night, and he was supposed to be in bed, but instead he was huddled by his bedroom window, gazing out across the backyard at a particular tombstone that was pressed almost directly against the back wall of their utility shed. He had been terrified of that tombstone ever since his brother Ryan had brought it to his attention that If the grave markers had moved this close to their house, so had the graves which lay beneath. At first, he had tried to go to sleep, chastising Bailey under his breath through the wall, but something about Bailey's rage had drawn him from his blankets to the window. He was now staring intently into the night beyond the porch light, trying to discern the object of Bailey's turmoil. So intense was his own concentration that he had not noticed when Bailey's collar had begun to stretch and tear under the tension of the dog's desperate, constant pull. It was all too late for him to react when he saw the light brown blur that was his dog flash across the yard and into the shadows beyond. "Mom! Ryan!" he yelled, summoning his mother in her bathrobe and his brother in pajama pants, sprinting down the hall not far behind. "Mom! Bailey ran off into the cemetery," he explained frantically as he pulled at the sleeve of the pink robe. "Not again." She was rolling her eyes in irritation and pushing Jessie back into bed. "I'll go get her, Mom," Ryan said stoically as he turned from the room. "Ryan, wait," Jessie said direly. She was barking at something out there, and I think it was scaring her. "It's all right, dear," his mother sleepily mumbled as she patted his back robotically. "Ryan's a big boy. I'm sure he can handle it." Jessie looked at the dark brown hand which comforted him and squeezed it gently. Jessie heard the back door slam and watched out the window as his brother, still in his pajamas but donning heavy rubber boots, walked off into the darkness with a leash in one hand and a flashlight in the other, calling as he went to the escaped Bailey. Jessie's brother stared at him in confused nervousness with dark brown eyes as he began to weep in her arms. She asked him what was wrong, but he could not explain that in some dark place within his mind, he knew he would never see his brother or Bailey alive again. "Well, we were saying that Kurt had to see the cemetery, right?" Cho said semi-humorously as he, Angel, and Kurt got out of his car and stared at the large rusted archway that marked the beginning of the cemetery path. It was 6:30 in the morning as they approached the crowd of locals who gathered around the town sheriff, who was an older man with a German accent named Diedrich Abendroth, who was the husband of the school dean. By his side was a smiling younger officer who Kurt heard being referred to as Deputy Stone. Even now, first thing in the morning, there was a heavy blanket of humid warmth pressing down as the sun climbed into the sky over the roofs and treetops of Mossborough. The group of some 40 citizen volunteers was mumbling in worried tones before the sheriff raised his hand and brought instant silence. "Yes, if I may have your attention, please. Thank you all for coming. I am sure that you have heard that we have a 14-year-old boy missing in the area. He disappeared last night looking for his dog, and we fear he may be in the woods, hurt. Herr Hashfield has graciously come with his dogs, who we all know can find anything with a scent within a week. Our plan is simple. For right now, we will spread out in a solid line traversing the cemetery, and then on into the woods. Be very careful out there. We don't need any extra emergencies." Kurt, Angel, and Cho walked 2 yards apart up the gradually increasing incline of the hill, weaving between the grave markers and watching as the stones grew older and more worn as they climbed. The cemetery truly was a spectacle to behold, and Kurt was disturbed by the thought of hundreds of graves running together in a molten mass of coffins and bones just below the surface of the soft earth beneath his feet. Kurt studied the mist that hung over the low areas and contemplated Angel as she walked between he and Cho, weaving through the tombstones with her strange natural grace. This morning it was obvious that she was ill at ease. She seemed distant and removed during the drive out to Cemetery Hill, as if she had been presented with a stunning fact that she could not comprehend. Kurt wondered if maybe whatever was happening to him was rubbing off on her. He was now convinced that all of this hinged on Angelica. She was the axis on which this strange reality was turning. He could not reconcile his new memory with the emerging alternate, which was brutally erupting volcanically at sporadic intervals within his mind. He had lain in bed within the dark of morning thinking, if this is 2002, then the attacks in New York were just last year. But then it had occurred to him that no one had even mentioned the terrorists. And that was when he realized that it had never happened. The entire event had been erased by whatever mechanism that had created and was sustaining this alternate reality. However, if what the book was describing was indeed what he was experiencing, this was no fragmented, divergent timeline. The spheres of which the book described were beyond the description of known physics. Even in the 2021, which Kurt remembered, everywhere that Kurt looked, he saw a real, solid world. But behind it all was a flashing rush of disturbing peculiarities. The town, the love family, the college, and the library. Kurt was unable to dismiss the feeling that he was inside someone else's dream. It's just not right, Angel said loudly, shattering the semi-trance Kurt had fallen into. What isn't? Cho asked as they approached the top of the hill where the town's founders were buried in a small mausoleum. Kurt stared at the closed doors as the sun's rays shone orange and crimson over the gray stone carved with what else but vine-like snakes. Nobody ever goes missing in Mossborough, Angel stated, holding out her hands helplessly for emphasis. Let alone anyone getting hurt or something. It's just not right. Kurt studied her intensely and noticed that her skin was pale white and beaded with sweat. Her eyes had a dazed, tired look, and he soon became certain that she may be falling ill as well. People go missing everywhere, Angel, Kurt said, awaiting her reaction. Kurt, people don't even speed in Mossborough. She was leaning on an above-ground tomb, staring off towards the adjacent paths, as if she were on the verge of tears. Where does that path go? Kurt asked, as he realized that questioning Angel in her present state could bring no positive results. He was certain that on some level she had realized that something was going wrong in the strange bubble surrounding her. It goes down to the ocean. There used to be a dock down where they think ships would make drop-offs for the Loves. They could bring things up here and hide it so that my grandfather could have someone collect it later. And what about the other way? They used it to lead to another trail that passes the lake and eventually leads to the back of the estate. Are we going back there? Kurt asked, as he remembered seeing the woods from above and the thing that appeared in the lake. Even Cho noticed the look of relief that passed over his face when Angel announced that she felt too sick to continue. Kurt could not have brought himself to follow that trail and see the dark waters of the lake before him. The search carried on without them, and no sign of the boy or the dog was found. The trained hounds caught a scent that led from the house where the boy had last been seen down the trail into the woods. The sheriff and a group of 4 followed until they arrived at the area surrounding the lake, where they immediately overwhelmed by what they observed. By some fluke, there had been a strange surge in the water snake population that could only be described as miraculous. And as the locals were quick to point out, the majority appeared to be cottonmouths. The sheriff immediately radioed his deputy to hold back the other teams as the area appeared almost impassable. The dogs had become exceedingly nervous and refused to follow the trail any further. It began to appear that quite possibly the boy had followed the Cocker Spaniel into a freak out-of-season breeding explosion of poisonous snakes, and finding him would be impossible anytime soon. It's got to be the weather, Mitch Hatchfields had explained as they studied the swirling forms of hundreds of snakes rippling on the shore of the lake and warming their cold bodies on the rocks nearby. This heat wave must have confused them into thinking it was spring. Yes, the dog must have been barking at them for days, the sheriff added. Little dogs ain't got no sense at all. Bailey probably ran right out here into that mess of them. Hashfields was shaking his head sadly and could not bring himself to say out loud what they were thinking. Here, Hashfields, is there any way you can think of to clear out these things quickly? Well, sir, clearing out a breeding population like this would be damn near impossible. We'll have to wait until the weather cools or just keep looking out here in a small group. There's plenty of fellas in town, though, who will hunt these bastards, and we'd have a hell of a snake fry, but it'll be a week before we can even put a dent in it. We will get everyone we can out here to help. But I only want experienced snake wranglers out here for the moment. I do not want to lose any more people. I will call Biloxi and see if we can get some help. The sheriff removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his bald head as he contemplated how to explain to the boy's mother that his dead body was probably laying in the woods, covered in water moccasins. As Cho turned the car around, he was suddenly stricken by a wave of dizziness, which forced him to quickly stop the car in mid-circle. What the hell? He rubbed his eyes with shaking hands, and his eyes lost focus as the world blurred through the windshield. Kurt, I think you're going to have to drive, man. I'm not feeling right at all. I think I'm catching that flu you had. Damn, I never get sick. Neither do I, Angel added, as sweat poured from her forehead and she resisted the urge to vomit. Kurt, just get me to my apartment. Sure, Kurt sighed as he took the keys from Cho's trembling hands and tried not to acknowledge that he was growing extremely frightened by the downward spiral of events that the morning seemed to be descending into. Before they had left, he had heard the sheriff radioing the deputy about a huge mass of poisonous snakes at the lake. He tried desperately to refuse what his mind and every fiber of intuition was shouting from his gut. He has come through a gate, just as described in the book. And what could he want here? What had happened after his death in what other world he had traveled from? Kurt dropped Angelica off at her apartment and watched to make sure she made it to the door, where she weakly waved before turning the key and walking in. His hesitancy to leave her was only surpassed by the knowledge that he had to get Cho to the dorm. But he would come back. Angel had to be protected. "You'll look in on Angel, right?" Cho said as if reading Kurt's thoughts. "Yeah, I don't think she should just be there alone and sick. Do you?" Paging Dr. Hartman, we have an emergency. This woman's panties are on fire." Kurt rolled his eyes in amazement that Cho was still laughing, even as his face drained to the palest gray he had ever seen on human skin. "Wow, pull over, man." Kurt did as he was instructed, in just enough time to save Cho the act of soiling his seats with his own throw-up. Apparently, nature had thrown a monkey wrench into Sheriff Abendroth's plans. In spite of all reason, and acting against everything that he knew of the occurrence of illness, the town of Mossborough had gotten sick. The town clinic was overrun, and as the doctors and nursing staff grew ill themselves, was forced to close. As his own fever climbed, he began convinced that they had caught something in the woods earlier that day. By noon, he had been forced to rely on his deputy, who, although ailing, was not succumbing as quickly as himself. It had been Deputy Stone who suggested that they call the Center for Disease Control and ask for advice. After 15 minutes, they had been informed that any outside help they had requested in their search for the missing boy would have to be postponed until test results identified exactly what strain of virus was affecting the town. The disease control representative had responded to his query about the snakes with great concern. She had warned him that a bacterial infection caught by humans from reptiles could be extremely dangerous and hard to treat. She had then mentioned bird and swine flu epidemics that had devastated rural populations. "Reginald," the sheriff had said as he slumped over his desk after turning off the speakerphone at the close of the conference call. "Yeah, boss," the younger man said as he poured ibuprofen tablets in his hand to fend off the chill he felt aching in his bones. "I am going home, so I can be sick with my wife. She sent me an email, and the illness has spread to the schools. The college will be closed, as will the high school, middle school, and elementary. As of right now, this town is under quarantine. I'm sorry, my friend, to put you in this position, but as you are the only remaining semi-healthy person I know right now, you are in charge. You must promise me you will not go back out to look for the boy. I need you here." "You have my word, Sheriff. Go home and get some rest." Diedrich nodded painfully and limped to the door of the police station where Reggie stopped him. "Hold up, boss." Reggie stood and put on his hat. "I'll drive you." The sheriff nodded his consent and waited as the deputy took him by the arm, and they left the building. After Deputy Reginald Stone dropped off the sheriff at his home, he found himself driving past the police station and towards the distant hill on the other side of town. One quick look around the cemetery wouldn't hurt. He couldn't just leave a boy's body laying rotting in the woods, as if there was any way he could find it. Kurt's own plan to immediately return to Angels and begin a 24-hour watch was shattered as he arrived back at the campus and carried Cho back to their room. Even the anteroom reeked of sickness and vomit as the few remaining students capable of movement dragged themselves between rooms in an effort to care for their fellows. Kurt had no sooner entered when he was confronted by Kira, who stood towering over him, her porcelain skin pasty and grayish. You are not sick?" She was swaying slightly as she tried to maintain her balance. Apparently not," he answered, as he prayed that Cho would not vomit on him as he stood waiting for the professor to move. You must help us care for the students. But no excuses, Mr. Hartman. You have been drafted." Kurt spent the remainder of the day running from room to room, dispensing acetaminophen and Mylanta as he tried to keep up with the constant calls for waters and blankets. He watched as the shadows grew longer and winced as he realized that he had not even called to check on Angel yet. Angel's fever had skyrocketed out of control. As soon as she had closed the door behind her after Kurt dropped her off, she had immediately regretted her decision to go home alone. She had turned on her television to Animal Planet and increased the volume to fill the room with the narrator's calm explanation of how snakes are silent, invisible predators that use their natural camouflage to become part of their environment and attack their prey before it is even conscious of their presence. She searched for her medicine cabinet for something that could alleviate the intense heat that was consuming her body. She found a bottle of Percocet that was left over from when she had sprained her ankle last fall, and finding nothing else, took two before stripping down to her underwear and laying down on top of her blankets. Although the pills did not seem to touch the fever, she did begin to feel the beginnings of a light relief in her mental state, as the room seemed to grow lighter and less confining. Her eyes fell to her television, which was shining like a window cut into the wall. She was looking at a tropical forest, and crawling along the branch of a tree was a python of the brightest green color she had ever seen. She smiled slightly as she realized it was as if the snake was glowing emerald and radiant as it stared out from the television with yellow, cat-like eyes. It was looking right at her, she was sure, watching her as she watched it. Something strange was happening. She felt as if she were floating on top of water, and all around her things were happening. All she had to do was glance for a moment, and she could see these things occurring as if they were actually there, but only through someone else's eyes. The sun was starting to go down, and the monuments of the cemetery were casting shadows, shaped like dark, opaque doors on the soft ground. His body was tense and nervous as he struggled to think clearly through the cloud of nausea as he walked across the sponge-like soil of the graves. Scenes from various zombie movies entered unbidden into his thoughts as the same scene flashed from the paranoid gallery. A hand rising from the earth to grab his leg and drag him down to be swallowed by the grave. The thought had terrified him since childhood, and now in his current state of illness it was torturing him with its surreal terror. He left the path and walked directly to the trail so long forgotten until that morning. The back of the cemetery had at one point had a flood wall built for when the lake would overflow, and a small gate still remained hidden within a twisted shroud of vines. He had cut most off, and he had no trouble opening it on the rusted, ancient hinges. There had been a time when he and his friends would simply jump the wall and follow the trail, still worn then, back to the lake for fishing. Later in the afternoon, they would journey further into the woods to the estate wall and hidden entrance. They would climb the wall and chew tobacco, daring each other to spit on the inside of the wall. This morning he had noticed that the path had still been visible, when to his reckoning it should have been indiscernible from the undergrowth and foliage. It appeared as if something had crushed down the underbrush to reveal a bizarre trail that reminded the deputy of the flattened aftermath of a crop circle. Someone had been back here recently, probably on a four-wheeler, he hypothesized, even though he had never seen a four-wheeler that left a single wide track that weaved through the grass as this did. The sun had dwindled to a mere sliver of orange over the trees as he proceeded forward through the now slushy wet weeds and growing swamp plants. Mosquitoes hung in a cloud visible before the cutting beam of his flashlight, now his only source of light. It had been a moment before when he had last glanced at the vanishing sun when he realized that clouds had formed overhead and there would be no moon or starlight. Never had he been so grateful for the can of DEET insect repellent that the sheriff always kept in the squad car. His mind was now scanning the archive of his memories to recall exactly what the trail was so clearly reminding him of. The packed broken grass and branches winding on into the darkness. It was as if his brain's search engine was thrusting an answer forward over and over again, but his feverish, weak consciousness was blocking it like a pop-up ad. The sound of insects was rising and falling all around him, and all was dark and alive in the swamp. Sweat was pouring from every pore of his skin, soaking his uniform to his body in sticky discomfort. His free hand, when not wiping sweat from his eyes, was constantly drifting back to his revolver. He had unclipped the holster so he could feel the hard comfort of the grip in his palm. How long had he been walking? He checked his watch. Something was wrong. He had left the squad car at 15 until 8 o'clock, and right now his watch read 8. He knew there was no way he had been walking for less than an hour. He assumed his Timex must be broken. The landscape was changing. The long grass at his sides was greener and grew to his waist. The air had grown increasingly humid, as if he had entered a greenhouse, and his fear of stepping on a cottonmouth had slowed his pace to a careful step by step over what was now mud beneath his boots. Curiously, he remembered the ground as being firm that morning. Finally, he crossed into the clearing of open space that surrounded the lake as the beam of his flashlight cut through the seemingly impenetrable darkness. He had not intended to be out here at night, and his confused thoughts could not formulate how exactly this had come to pass. He remembered it being around 6 when he had dropped off the sheriff, but being somewhat delirious now, he could not remember clearly what had transpired. The snakes, so visible in the early morning, sunning themselves to warm their cold-blooded, were now in hiding, and he found the shore of the lake vacant of the slithering forms. He stared out across the surface of the tranquil water and remembered swimming out to the middle as a teenager. It had been only after he was midway to the levee on the other side that he realized how far out he was, and how huge an area the lake covered. As his mind drifted over the memory, he thought of a television show he had watched about snakes the night before, where the narrator had been discussing anacondas in South America. He had been sitting at his kitchen table eating frozen pizza with his dog, a schnauzer named Odin, watching as two villagers led the camera crew through the wetlands. One of the villagers had been pointing at the grass and speaking his own language as the narrator translated. He remembered thinking that the narrator himself seemed to have a strong accent of some sort, as he said that the villager was indicating a long line of depressed reeds was the trail of one of the enormous snakes. Reggie's eyes widened with realization as he slowly turned and pointed the beam of his police-issue flashlight at the path from where he had just walked. Turning back, he crept closer to the edge of the water and watched as the dancing water bugs skittered across the glassy surface and tiny minnows darted in bustling communities underneath. The water was clearer and cleaner than he could ever remember it being in his childhood. He envisioned hordes of snakes swimming just out of view of his light and shuddered. He looked out over the lake and thought to himself that it seemed endless, and even more so, bottomless. He became enthralled by the quiet lapping of the water on the rocks, and despite his fears, could not help but imagine how cool and calming the water would feel over his feverish skin. Then, as he was gazing out towards the center, he could have sworn he saw a glint of shining green, and then movement, as a long shadow emerged and seemed to move through the water. He watched as the shape began to cut through the water in a graceful weave from side to side, coming towards him with languid, tranquil quickness, as if gliding on the dark, placid surface. Trembling, he held up the light and held his gun in his other hand as he waited for the thing to become more visible. He remembered the stories of the snake man that was rumored to live in the lake, told to him as a child, and now guessed that, although he could not gauge its length, it must surely have the width of a man's waist. Now the glow of his light was reflected by 2 points of shining green like emeralds. Within him a voice was screaming for him to turn and run as fast as he could, but a strong and overpowering fascination held him frozen to where he stood, mesmerized, as a massive, ridged, dragon-like head became visible. It had reached the shallows and began to rise up slowly, like a cut tree being lifted by loggers. Reggie, who was shaking, weak, and terrified, could no more make his body obey than he could believe what he was seeing. The thing moved forward, and the reptilian visage hovered only an arm's length from his face as their eyes met. Reggie choked as he tried to scream, but could not, only gasp and watch as the scales smoothed and lightened, the mouth shortened, the serpent's head transformed into a hideous, mutated human face. The wide mouth parted into a horrible, fanged semblance of a smile as the blank eyes gleamed with human intellect. "It's you," said a clear human voice. With all his might, Reggie tried to withdraw, to raise his gun, to scream out in terror, but he could only stand ready to crumble before the horror. "But how?" it asked, moving hypnotically from side to side in contemplation. "What has that little witch done? She brought you here, didn't she?" It was laughing now, a deep, sinister rasp following as a long snake's tongue tasted the air between them. "How many others, I wonder? Who did she collect, little policeman? Did she think she could hide you? And hide herself? I can taste her scent everywhere. Now the twisted face moved closer until Reggie could smell the awful, rank rot of its foul breath. "You took my love from me, and I killed you for it once. I only wish I could kill you 1,000 more times." Reggie watched as the thing's massive form reared back into the darkness, and then saw only the gaping, open jaws fly forward as the dripping, long fangs within closed over the entire world. Angel awoke screaming and contorted on her bed, staring wildly around the room as if the creature was there waiting. She rolled out and stumbled across the room and fell into the bathroom floor, vomiting onto the white porcelain of the toilet. The room was spinning uncontrollably, and she wept, terrified and alone in the darkness. She lay there shaking and crying as she told herself that it was only a dream induced by her fever. However, she could still smell the rank, hot breath of the creature as its mouth closed over her head. The creature had known its victim and had asked him how many she, the little witch, had brought here. Who was the thing talking about? What did it mean by bringing people here? She told herself that it didn't matter. It was only a dream. When a person becomes dependent on a substance, no matter which one, the entire functioning of their brain and personality become altered. The chemical reactions occurring in the numerous nervous centers of the mind develop an appetite for said substance, and when this hunger is not met, things no longer work accordingly. The brain is, in essence, an entity unto itself, and when it is trained to work in a certain manner, it seldom, if ever, recompenses after its treats are absent. Substance damages the brain, and it becomes enwrapped in the illusion that it needs whatever food the addict has been providing. The brain becomes an assistant to the addiction apart from the conscious rationale of the addict. Winning a fight with addiction is an intense effort to battle one's own brain as it tries to convince its host to resume their destructive behavior via many a devious and subtle method. The brain tells the addict that they were in fact functioning better when they had their drug of choice, and that all these people telling them that they were not are merely lying in an effort to control or hurt the addict. The addict may well find themselves thinking such thoughts as, "Why doesn't anyone want me to be happy? They are all so miserable that they just want me to be miserable too." And yes, the addict will be miserable for quite a while, perhaps on some levels forever. And the clever, sly addict brain will helpfully forget the horrid miseries of withdrawal and sickness that always accompanies addiction. The ever-caring brain will hide these memories of shame, loneliness, and hurt the addict inflicted on themselves and their loved ones. The brain is a tyrant and does not tolerate insurgents well. The addict brain, if given its way, will blissfully send its host spiraling to their death alone and utterly destroyed. Recovery is taking a stand against a brain that has turned against its own identity. If someone could take this abused and needy organ and remove the damage and want, then return it as fresh and new as it were pre-addiction, then a person may well find themselves in the midst of a remarkable awakening. This is what Angelica Love did for Kurt Hartman. He had battled his arrogant, tyrannical brain since adolescence, and she had finally staged a final battle in which it stood no chance of winning. What had been left was a new Kurt, who was in many ways as clean and revised as a child, but still retaining a knowledge and vision left from the experience of years in personal misery and torment. This was the Kurt Hartman the students met, hurriedly shuffling from room to room, caring for them with the patience and compassion of a parent tending to their own offspring. Yet there was something else, a peculiar buzzing electric aura that could be felt as soon as he entered the room. His touch held a warm tingle that somehow eased the suffering they felt. Later, many would agree that they all owed him an incredible debt. The day passed into a long night, and Kurt found himself in the bathroom of his dorm room splashing cold water on his face. He was exhausted and his vision blurred by droplets of water hanging from his lashes as he stared down at his hands. They had finally stopped shaking from the nervousness of trying to care for so many, but as he dried them on a dirty towel, he thought for a moment he noticed a green glow was as he rubbed them. He remembered the glow well, but even now, with all he had experienced, he resisted belief in what he had seen. He shook his head and forced himself to focus on matters at hand. Everyone was more or less resting, and it was time to go check on Angel. As he walked from the bathroom, he saw that a storm had developed outside, and rain was pounding against the large window by his bed. Determined to be delayed by nothing, he grabbed the unconscious Cho's car keys and rushed out of the room and down the dark hallway, now lit by occasional blasts of lightning. All was silent as he exited the front doors, running through the warm rain across the campus courtyard and out through the gate to the parking lot. He opened the door and leapt into the car as he placed the key in the ignition. He glanced up at the rear view and immediately froze in terror. Sitting behind him in the back seat was the pale, transparent figure of a woman he recognized all too well, her eyes glowing white with eerie, otherworldly, luminescent light. He dared not turn to face her, but heard her say clearly as she leaned forward until her ghostly lips could almost touch his ear. "He's here, Kurt. He's found her, and you must protect her." "Maxine," he barely managed to gasp before finding the courage to turn in his seat, but she was gone, and he was alone with the rain pounding on the roof of the car. Terror filled him as he thought of Angel alone and sick at her apartment, clueless that anything was wrong in her strange world. He began to drive, and only then did he realize that although he could no longer see Maxine, she was still there. He could still hear her speaking within his mind. He came to the mansion as his last refuge, and there he found the gate. It was the reason my parents chose to come there, since it is a power point where their energies would be strengthened. He was drawn to it when all else was lost to him. He destroyed everything real and twisted the world into a nightmare. I had stayed in the mansion watching as the world fell into ruin and his abominations roamed free. The few survivors huddled in sacred places where he could not reach them, and he devoured all those that he could hunt. However, his appetite for flesh could not be satiated, and when there was no more prey for his twisted appetite, his power dwindled, and he became trapped in the form he had so ambitiously sought after. Hell is not a place, but a creation of conscious will, an infection of perceptive reality. Demons invade reality and bring with them their diseased perception. They find creatures that can wish and feel so that they can taint them with deteriorated consciousness. Demons sleep, and they draw all those waking into their dreams. When all else is destroyed, they will move on like a virus seeking another host. Andrew came to the mansion as a great serpent swimming through the rooms in desperation to find a way out of the nightmare he had created for himself. Just as my parents had explored insane powers in an effort to escape the curse laid out for them by their own ancestors, they had sold their children to be free of the curse, which would take them at their death. Would you believe that love was what undid them? Until their time, there had always been 2 twins born to take the curse of 2 twins dying. But by some accident of destiny, only one was born born first, and that was David. As time passed, they gave birth to their twins, but by this time, they had become enwrapped in their illusion of humanity. They had come to love their children, and had 2 more single births, Henry and Maxine. That was when, through their studies, they thought to create a ritual by which one could be sacrificed, and all the rest would be free, and humans to live out their human lives. They would slay their firstborn, and let him suffer the horrors of undeath. But the serpent was not appeased, and so took them, leaving behind a monstrosity and 4 small children still laden with the curse of their family. I watched Andrew as he swam out to the center of what had been the lake and found the door where his last remaining power. He pierced the gate and passed through. I had grown weary of hiding and waiting for any small ray of hope to light what had become a dark and haunted world. So out of desperation, and no small amount of curious terror at what he might do, I followed. When I arrived here, I was amazed to see what Angelica had done, and horrified that Andrew had found his way here. "What has she done, Maxine?" Kurt asked, watching the slow wipers swashing from side to side in the steadily falling rain as he drove. "Is it really that hard for you to understand? She has created this sphere and brought the spirits of those she could collect from the lost earth to inhabit it. But how does she not know what is going on? Because she has divided herself in 2. The Angelica that you have met is but the shell of the complete being she was. She is existing as a mere shallow identity apart from the energy and memories from that other world. She has severed herself from the power that once shaped her life so that she might live out some fantasy created in her past. So, where is the rest of her? Somewhere here, I am sure, trying to protect her until she is either ready or willing to be a complete person again. But what about the skull? What is it doing here?" Kurt was suddenly hit with a jolt of cold electricity as the ghost became more visible in the back seat behind him, her face an expression of shock and her hands grasping at him in freezing blasts. He lost control of the car as it ran up the curb by the street and rolled onto the sidewalk and crashed into a tree. He floundered in the airbag, still trying to recover from the horrid cold Maxine had unintentionally inflicted on him in her panic. He could hear her voice, frantic and hysterical in his mind. "How do you know?" "Maxine, I have seen it at least 3 times. That damn book is in the library." Kurt was struggling to get out of the car. Stepping out into the rain, he found himself face to face with the glowing white form through which rain was passing visibly as if through halogen light. "How could you not know that? The skull was in the dream walk when you awakened my memory. Have you seen it materialized, or only in visions?" I really can't say for sure. I've been in and out of it lately. I'm not even really sure that I'm talking to you right here, right now." "You are. And if the skull has been contacting you in visions, only then something is keeping it from materializing. Most likely, Angelica." "Whose side is it on, anyway? I mean, I'm trying to keep up speed here, Maxine, but I'm really having a problem grasping this whole skull thing." Kurt was relieved to see that the apparition seemed to have calmed as the light she was emanating dimmed considerably, and once more he felt the humid warmth of the strange heat wave. "Kurt, the skull is an entity from our world originally, but it is capable of crossing spheres almost effortlessly. The skull was the entity which warned me of Andrew's plot. I thought only spirits can travel. It is a spirit, Kurt. The spirit of Maximiano Mascadov, bound within the shelter of his own remains. In life, he was like you, a thief of energies, able to draw from any demonic power, even though in life he had no knowledge of his ability, as it had lain mostly dormant. I'm not sure why or how, but he was forced to hide himself within his remains in order to avoid some great adversary of a demonic nature. But he was something original unto itself, with the ability to travel like the dead, but wield shamanic power like the living. If the skull is contacting you, then you must find out what it wants. All lines are open, Maxine. I just don't think it's quite as simple as you think. Where have you been experiencing your visions? At the mansion, I guess. Because that is when you are closest to the gate. You must go to the mansion and open yourself. Can we go check on Angel before I go opening myself to skulls? Kurt saw that she had actually gotten so caught up in her discovery that she had forgotten about their current mission. Of course, go now, but I must leave you. There is much for me to examine. Just remember that by its very nature, the skull is dangerous and its motives incomprehensible. I believe that it is most likely working for some greater good, but such a being cannot be fully trusted. As she spoke these last words, Maxine faded from view. Oh, now you leave, Kurt cried out in frustration as she faded into space. Now that you wrecked the car. The man stepped from the water and out into the rain. He listened to the sound of the drops as they fell onto the leaves of the woods and smiled with delight. He rubbed his long hands over his chest and shivered with excitement to feel the warm, soft white skin that covered him. The lightning flashed, and he looked upon his arms and naked lower body, laughing with joy to see the familiar sight of the hundreds of phrases written upon him. Not wanting to waste any time, he began walking towards the space where he knew the path once began that led to home, his old home. Everything around him was vibrant and alive. Here there were animals and birds sleeping in the trees, and his beloved snakes curled in snug corners beneath the rocks, resting. He waved his hands over the undergrowth, and a tattoo on his hip glowed green momentarily as the tall grass parted and revealed the path long buried. He began his walk like a child, taking his first glimpse at a carnival, eyes wide with wonder and smiling all the while. His long hair streamed rain over his shoulders as he traversed the forest with a racing heart, anticipating his first sight of the house, so clear in his memory. He approached the wall that stood covered in vines and leaves and once more waved his hand, dispersing them to reveal a great black gate of iron. He stared down at the rusted chain and lock wrapped between the bars before gently laying his hand upon it. The lock glowed emerald and fell to the ground as he pushed it open with loving ease. He walked onto the estate and immediately found his cold mind warm and vivid with images of the past. Then, as if in a dream of some lost love, stared upon the mansion, huge, white, and foreboding in the darkness. All was exactly as it had been. She had remade it all perfectly. Oh, my dear child, you have truly outdone yourself, he whispered to the night, before continuing his journey to the only home he had ever